I want to share the process I've used to create many of my bonsai trees, or at least to get many of my bonsai trees started. Say I had a friend who wanted to get into bonsai. This is advice that I give them. So this is going to be highly summarized, very generalized, just a quick start guide, and I'll refer to other sources that I've used that have given me further guidance and more details on how to do this. And so it takes about a year, my process, and that's again just to get a bonsai tree started. But at the end of the year, hopefully it can result in a tree um, like this tree. This tree is a few years in, but a tree like this tree that, somebody who's not a bonsai enthusiast, but is aware of what bonsai is, will look at your creation and say, looks like a bonsai tree. I'll share the steps that I've used, you know, over the course of a year, and it's kind of a calendar too that I'll be sharing on when to do stuff. Step number one is go to a garden center and choose a tree or shrub that appeals to you. And you can do this anytime during the growing season when your local garden centers are selling plants. And so that's, for me, it's like, April to maybe September, October. Anyway, so I go to a garden center. I've done this many times. I still do it. I did it this spring. Went to a garden center and just look around and find something that appeals to you. So what are some things to look for in a garden center plant? Here's a Chinese elm that I recently picked up at a garden center, and I'll use it to illustrate some of these points. So first off, is the species suitable for bonsai? Right there at the garden center, I'll often do a Google search of the species and bonsai to see if there are examples on the internet of people using the species. In this case, this is a Chinese elm, which is very popular for bonsai. Second, you can look at the nabari. The nabari is the base of the trunk right here, where it meets the soil. And in this case, I thought this tree had a pretty nice nabari because it has some roots coming from each portion of the trunk. And there isn't severe inverse taper. Nabari is often buried at garden centers, so I will kind of put my finger down there and kind of unbury it without disturbing the plant too much. But sometimes this is pre-buried, so it's kind of a gamble if you get the plant. Then moving up from there, just looking at the trunk, does the trunk look nice? Or is it, sometimes it's weird in a good way and you like that. It has a nice curve or twist. Often it'll be really straight, but you can maybe find a trunk line within the branches that you think will be good that you can prune to. And this, I can't really give guidance. Each plant that's specific, each plant is very much an individual, so it's just something that appeals to you. And this trunk very much appealed to me. I liked the branch structure of this tree because it reminded me of the elms that I've seen in my neighborhood, and I think it just already had a good start, and I knew I could use these branches. Another thing to look for in a plant, especially if you want to make a smaller bonsai, is leaf size. Are the leaves big or small? These leaves are very small, which is often a good characteristic for bonsai, which is making a miniature tree, right? So small leaves versus big leaves. But you can make a bonsai with all sorts of plants, and often if you do want to make a bonsai with something with big leaves, you might just want to make a bigger bonsai. And then last piece of advice with selecting material from a garden center is, you can certainly find something that is $10, $20, $30 that you could make into a nice small bonsai. Or the plants that result in the best trees for me have often been more like $50, $60, $70, or $80. So I'd plan to spend a little bit more. And the reason why I think they're perhaps a better starting point, spending just a little bit more, like $50 or even $100, is you'll just buy an older plant that has a bigger trunk to start with. And the bigger the trunk, often the more convincing of an image you can make of an older tree. And you're kind of just buying time, right? You're buying more time in a pot, more growth, a bigger plant for a little bit more money. So yeah, those are some things to look for when selecting garden center material. Number two in the process is style the top, but generally leave the roots alone that first growing season, right after you choose your plant. And you can immediately start working on your tree right after purchase, especially if it's earlier in the year. This time of year it's getting a little late to do that. But during the growing season, you can start working on the top of your plant. but leaving the roots alone. And so this is where I'm going to just be super general and refer you to other sites, because I'm not going to go over, how to style a tree, because I think that has been covered quite a bit online, and this is again more of a calendar. But generally, the guidance is, and what I've done is, you buy a tree that's often pretty tall. I've even bought trees that are, 4 or 5 feet tall, and then you cut them down drastically to be much shorter. I know one of my Japanese maples, I bought a tree that I think was nearly as tall as me, almost 6 feet tall, and I cut it down to maybe 18 inches tall. So that's one of the big things that you often do, just again general. And then often accompanied with that is pruning off a lot of the branches and shortening the branches. But again, I know that's very not much guidance at all. But I will refer you to 2 sources that I think have really good videos that are targeted for beginners, buying nursery material and doing this process. And those 2 sites that I found especially useful are Bonsai Empire. Has a bunch of demonstrations that are about 10 minutes long that really go over, like pruning branches specifically, wiring branches, another way you can style your tree. You can do both. And then the other one is Heron's Bonsai, whose his philosophy, Peter's philosophy, is very much bonsai for everyone. And he has numerous demonstrations on, like, okay, here's a normal garden center material plant, and now I'm going to make it look like a bonsai. And there's tons of demonstrations. So I recommend go to those 2 sites, and there's many others. Those are just 2 that stand out to me. They're very much directed at beginners, starting with, humble garden center material. Third step, and I already said this, but I'm just going to emphasize it, is for the most part, just if you want to play it safe, just leave the roots alone that first growing season. You can just keep it in that nursery container. It's not going to look like a bonsai yet that first season, because it'll be in a container. You can, do some work on the roots. I guess I'm just recommending, to play it safe, is kind of leave the roots alone that first year. Also, just a footnote here too, I have broken this rule quite a few times and it's been okay. However, I think maybe I have slowed my trees down a bit. For instance, I know I broke this rule with this tree. I styled the top and the bottom at the same time, right in the growing season, although I didn't do heavy work on the roots. And there really is a difference between, cutting most of the roots off and cutting, 1/3 or a quarter of the roots off. You can maybe do some root work, but for the most part, if you want to just play it safe, keep your tree alive, ensure survival, just leave the roots alone. And I guess I haven't mentioned too, with the growing season after styling, is you just leave the tree alone. And the tree needs to eat and it needs water. So trees eat with light. Light is their food. So your house or your apartment inside is basically a cave for a tree. So if you can grow your tree outside, it'll do much better. It'll get much more light. It'll be able to grow. A tree inside is basically starving. It's hungry. Unless you have a very powerful grow light, you want to keep your tree outside. So now on to the winter time. And I guess this is a guide for my climate, because this is what I do. And my climate gets cold in winter. It gets well below freezing for many months of the year. So overwintering a tree, if you've bought a tree at a garden center, a local garden center, chances are, if it is in the outside section, it is cold hardy to your climate. The top is cold hardy. There's a difference between top cold hardiness and bottom cold hardiness. So you might need to protect the roots of your tree in the winter that are in a pot. You can do that by burying it in the ground, or what I do is just keeping it in your unheated garage for the winter. And dormant trees, they're not like growing trees. They don't need as much light and they don't need as much water. When my trees are dormant, I often keep them in a dim garage. They don't get light, and I water them. Instead of watering them, every few days or every day in the growing season, I water them maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, and that's all they need. So overwinter a tree. All right, so that'll take you into to step number 5 here, and to the next spring. when the tree is about to start growing, that's when you can repot your tree. And again, this is where I'm going to refer you to other sources, because there are a lot of videos on the internet, quite a few from many bonsai channels that describe this process of repotting. But what repotting means basically is two things. It is one, of course, taking the tree out of the pot, pruning the roots, very similar to how you prune the top of a tree, you can prune the bottom of a tree, and you want to for bonsai. So repotting means pruning the roots, and then often changing that substrate that the tree's grown in. Nursery trees often come in this dense substrate that isn't always the best for bonsai. They're good for growing trees, and you can certainly grow your tree in whatever kind of medium. But I recommend putting your tree in something that's a little more free draining, that'll help you not overwater your tree, and really does promote. I've discovered using bonsai soil that it really does promote better root growth. So I like to use bonsai soil. So you want to do that in the spring. I'm just going to keep it general. I could get really specific about the exact timing, but basically in spring is when you can repot your tree, and that's when you could really give your roots more of a prune. It's very safe, I'd say, to remove, say, half of the root ball, and you'll probably be fine. You can even do more on some species, it's species specific. But a few channels that, again, I'll refer you to that I've found really helpful and I've learned from, that have numerous demonstrations on how to repot trees, and other whatever bonsai questions or guidance you have, are the Bonsai Zone, Nigel Saunders. I've watched a ton of Nigel. Bonsai, Eric, he's in California in the Bay Area. ACM Bonsai isn't really doing, he just moved to Japan, isn't really doing a lot of these beginner videos, but he has previous videos that are really good that I've loved. Notion Bonsai, he's this Adam in Ireland, Growing Bonsai by Yella, and there's many others. I'm not going to name them all, but those are just some suggestions on other bonsai channels that have some guidance specifically about repotting trees, I'm sure. You'll see really small pots being used for bonsai, but I personally kind of overpot my trees a little bit, meaning I put them in a pot that's maybe doesn't follow those rules that you'll read of in books of, like, you know, this is how big your pot should be. That often you really squeeze those roots down into a small space, and you can certainly take care of that trees that way. I think it's just a little bit harder. So I kind of overpot my trees a little bit, meaning I put them in a pot that's a little bit bigger. And then I'll end with the last step of what I do. So now it's been about a year, but that last, after I do, you know, that really drastic work the first growing season, and then I repot the tree, I just kind of leave my tree alone after that first repotting especially, and just let it go and recover. Because if you take off 50% of the roots, or even 75% of the roots, I think, you know, you just need to leave it alone, let it grow. And once that tree starts growing again strongly, then you can start working on it again, start pruning it again, and the process kind of repeats yearly. And hopefully after a few years, especially, you can have a tree that especially starts to look very much like a bonsai. So that's the video. It's super quick, I know, very generalized, and more of a calendar. But it is a process I've used with many of my trees here. I'm looking at my larch, my thuja, my Japanese maples back there. I have a couple. I use this process, and it takes about a year, but it's worked for me. So hopefully the same can work for you.